while I don't usually try to do topical talks or ones that are timely or anything, I did think that with a major election approaching, I don't know if you guys know, we're having an election in this country pretty soon. I thought the work that Dana's been doing, that I think I only became aware of with the Kickstarter project for the field guides, but that if I read your bio correctly, you've been doing for more than 8 years, or the last 8 years. Dana Chisnell is the person federal and state election officials call on when they need to do something about ballot usability and design. The whole idea of design actually having a real impact in the real world, not that it doesn't usually, but that having it affect the way society works or the outcomes in major elections, I think is the hinge that really struck me as something that should be very interesting to hear about. Over the last 8 years, Dana has trained more than 1,000 election officials to test the designs of their ballots to avoid costly mistakes and unwarranted attention. It must not be fun when the reporters come. She's given highly rated presentations and workshops for a dozen state election departments and conferences, as well as voter advocacy groups and secretaries of state. Please join me in welcoming Dana Chisnell.
Thanks for that. Let's start here. This is a form. That's all it is. It's just a form. And the important thing about this form is that this is a form that's used in perhaps one of the most important interactions between a citizen and her government. And this particular form changed everything. This is a ballot from the 2000 presidential election from Palm Beach County, Florida. And the way this ballot works is it's in a booklet form, and there's this thing called a punch card, very ancient computing technology, long oblong card with a bunch of little boxes perforated in it that are numbered. And you slide the card behind the little booklet, and it lines up with the holes in the middle. And the voter, to make their choice, pushes through the little hole to punch that little perforated box out. That's a CHAD. This is, like all forms, the culmination of a big pile of design decisions. But there was one really key decision that really made the difference on this. Now, this is perfectly good voting technology from about the 1960s. It worked really well for a really, really long time. Still wouldn't be bad, except there was this whole fracas. But the main design decision that came into this, that changed everything, was a really simple one. And it's probably a decision that any one of us would have made. And that was to make the type bigger than the template usually used. Why is my slide? Okay. So ideally, the ballot looks more or less like this, with all of the candidates lined up on the left-hand side of the page. And so the numbers and the arrows all line up with individual arrows. But when you increase the type size, that changes the relationships of all of the things on the page, and it poured half of the presidential contest over onto the right-hand page in this sort of interlaced thing. So if you want to vote for Al Gore and Joe Lieberman, which hole do you punch now? Thousands actually thought it was the second hole here. It's actually the third hole. If you punch the second hole, you're actually casting a vote for Pat Buchanan and his running mate, a super conservative religious guy. Couldn't be more different from Al Gore, and probably not the guy a bunch of Jewish grannies in Florida actually intended to vote for. But lots and lots of them did, they realized later. Now, this design decision to increase the type size was a perfectly reasonable decision to make. As I said, it's the kind of thing any one of us would have decided to do, knowing that most of your constituents are over the age of 60. What all old people want is bigger type, after all, right? But nobody tested this. There's no such thing as usability testing in this world. It happens on election day, So there's no data, really, to base this decision on. Now, it was excellent public administration, but it wasn't good design. So the outcome, you all know what the outcome was. The Supreme Court stopped all the recounts and appointed George Bush 43rd President of the United States. Nothing had ever happened like this in United States history. It was a series of cascading mistakes of various kinds that started out with this very simple design decision. So design actually does affect world peace. I am firmly of the belief that if that decision had been made differently, we would be in a very different place in the world. And it keeps happening. So even though all states now have newer voting systems since 2000, with every new technology, we introduce new usability and design and accessibility problems. And so even if you get to the point where you're at the polling place and you've proved your citizenship, you get handed a ballot that is still not so easy to use. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One of the key reasons is that there are design specifications in election code in every state in this country. They define what the typeface should be, what the type size should be, what the grid of the ballot should be, what the instructions should say. And most of the instructions were written in like 1890 by a bunch of white guys who, just really wanted to make voting difficult for a lot of people. They've succeeded in a lot of ways. This is actually the code from New Jersey. So that's the first thing. There's a ton of design embedded in legislation. The second reason is that voting systems themselves are awful. They were written and designed in the mid-1990s. So what operating systems were available then? Yeah, I shudder to think. And they're still running on those things. So even if election system vendors wanted to do good design, which I haven't seen any evidence of yet, it takes a long time to create a good system, and then it has to go through certification, which can take up to 2 years and cost a couple $1 million. Sounds sort of like pharmaceuticals, doesn't it? The back end of voting systems are worse than the front ends. So the election administration part is so hard that in most places, the people who are responsible for ballot design, especially on paper, just send their database back to their voting system vendor to lay out the ballot because it's just too hard. These things don't interface with InDesign. Third is costs. States and counties have no money right now. They are getting less and less money all the time. And it's very expensive to maintain what's now basically major IT. Elections were not always like this, but there's more and more computing involved all the time. Even if you're running paper ballots through an optical scan, there are scanners and there are tabulation systems and other kinds of systems on the back end. Maryland, the state of Maryland in 2004 decided that they wanted to go to all touchscreen direct record electronic voting systems. And so they bought tons of them. And a couple of years ago, they actually did a study to determine how much it cost to have those systems in place instead of using paper, because they're getting a lot of pressure from advocates and voters to just use paper ballots. And they found that it actually cost 179% more to run their electronic systems than it would to run the old paper systems. Because there's storage, that's part of it, but a lot of it is software and hardware upgrades, cannibalizing enough machines to keep the ones that you have going, and dealing with software and hardware bugs that happen all the time. Security is a whole different issue here too, right? You can't connect a voting system to the internet or to a wireless network because legally, because this is, of course, is a security vulnerability. So the other parts of the cost come from who controls what. So local officials don't actually own the UI to their own voting system, for example. They don't own that screen, either on the tabulator or on the touch screen. And this makes it also very difficult to do recounts when somebody else basically owns that system. Paper isn't that much cheaper, especially when you live in a state like California, where about 50% of all the ballots are cast by mail. Local election officials really like vote by mail because that means that they have a much better idea how many ballots are actually coming in on election day. But also, if you go to all vote by mail, like there are a couple of counties in California, and Washington and Oregon are all vote by mail, you don't have to hire and train poll workers to be in a polling place. You can start the election 30 days before election day and be done at 8 o'clock when the polls officially close. But we know that people make more mistakes when they vote by mail than they do when they're in the polling place. This is a ballot from New York State, and this is another one of those constraints. Every state has its quirky little election culture. California has its with voter initiatives. And New York was the last state to transition from their old system to a new system. And they had mechanical lever machines. They have a very romantic attachment. They're very sentimental about their mechanical lever machines. And so the Board of Elections in New York decided that to help people make the transition from the old mechanical lever machines, where you go into a booth, you throw the first lever, closes a curtain behind you, and then to cast your vote, you click, click, click. A physical, mechanical thing, a switch, you throw a switch to cast your vote, that they moved to a paper optical scan that looks just like a mechanical lever system. So this is a full face ballot, right? That means that all of the contests are on one side of the paper. So it has to be as big as it needs to be to fit everything that's in the election. Now, one of the things I love about this particular ballot is the instructions. So the instructions are on the right, not the left. And it says, before voting this ballot, please read the instructions on the other side of the ballot. Which were wrong for this election, by the way, in 2010. Because they hadn't updated the legislation for the instructions to match the new voting system. So there's legislation, there are costs, there's history and culture of voting where you are, but there's also this other human factor. Now, these are county clerks and registrars. I know these people. They are some of the nicest, most accessible people on the face of the earth. They are very available. You know, if you called up your election department and said, how can I help? They would talk to you for an hour about how it works. They're really generous and wonderful people. But you might also be saying, I can imagine, that, you know, maybe you work in highly regulated industry, like banking or biotech or something like that. You know, there are lots of regulations to deal with. There are lots of legacy systems to deal with. These are constraints that we all face. But the people who are designing ballots are not designers. They are not UX people. They're not even IT people. They are literally public officials. They're clerks and registrars, usually the kind of people who are responsible for vital records. They keep track of birth and death records, marriage records, things like that, deeds sometimes. They're mostly women. Most of them have been in this job, either appointed or elected, for 20 or more years. And so they started out, lots of them who are in this job right now, in a very different election world from the one that they're in now. And they're having to catch up. So, as I say, they are excellent public servants, and they're trying to do the right thing, and they're highly skilled at public administration. They are awesome, awesome people, but they are not designers. So to kind of give you an idea of how big this issue is, there are over 3,000 counties, boroughs, or parishes that hold elections in the United States and territories. This is actually where elections are run in the United States. And there's at least one of those people who is there trying to do that. Each state has a Secretary of State, and that's the person who owns elections in that state. And in California, Deborah Bowen her office creates a template for the ballot. It has specific things that are required by law, and each county has to follow that. In Ohio, if a county doesn't follow the template that's issued by the Secretary of State, the clerk can be removed from her job legally. So while they get the ballot from the state, they're responsible at the local level for carrying out the election. And this means that there are things that they have to deal with that the state doesn't really care about, that the state doesn't even necessarily know about, because there are elections for dog catcher and school board and water commissioner, and they have to fit all that into the template that they're given too. And sometimes it doesn't work very well. In Ohio, there's a state issue that a court order made the day after ballots actually went to press, increased the size of the description of the measure that's on the ballot by 100%, and so all the ballots had to be redesigned overnight to be printed. These are the kinds of things that happen they have to deal with. There's a federal election coming up, as Christian mentioned, because you probably hadn't heard about it before that. But there are elections happening all the time. Not just the midterm election that happens to elect senators and governors and kind of what's called the off year, but there are school board elections that counties run and all kinds of special elections that go on in between that most people don't pay any attention to. But it doesn't mean that there are these long cycles between the major elections where nothing is happening. It actually means that there's a lot happening. And so these people are busy all the time. So the butterfly ballot story sparked the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in 2002. And that made money available to all of the states for them to replace their old voting systems and to put an accessible voting system in every single polling place in the country. This is the first time that it had ever happened. These are phenomenal things, but the problem was never with the technology. It was with design. It was never with security. It was with usability. And with every new technology, we introduce new voting problems, new usability problems. And so we see this over and over. But it turns out that ballot design issues are pretty well understood. Unfortunately, it's because we hear from voters, and this has ripple effects in election departments, in the press, and eventually leads to people not trusting what's happening in elections. The thing that we don't really realize, most of us, is that even though there are all these smart people in the room, lots of high-level degrees here, I'm going to bet that in the last election you made at least one mistake on your ballot when you voted. Everybody does make mistakes. And this means that thousands of votes go uncounted or missing because they're miscast in some way. It doesn't matter what the technology is that you're using. People make mistakes equally on all the platforms that we know about right now. And we do know that some people are at a higher risk for making mistakes. Like I said, people make more mistakes when they vote by mail than they do when they're in the polling place. But add in age and minority status, and you see an uptick pretty quickly. Now, ballots are pretty simple. Like I said, it's just a form, and there's a really basic anatomy here. There are instructions, and there are contests, and in most places, well, in about half of the states, there are questions or issues or measures or referenda that go on the ballot. California has more of them than any place else. And there are some classic problems that we see that come up. One of them is when contests get split between two columns on a paper ballot. But it also happens when you have a computerized, touch screen, and you have more than one contest on the same screen. These are basic UI rules. You would think we would be able to get this. You have to mark the ballot somehow, somewhere. And when that appears, and I'll show you some examples of this, on either side of choices where there's the possibility of it actually lining up with any one of the choices laterally, then people mark weird things. California uses arrows. You connect the arrow on your paper ballots. But it turns out that performance is better for users when they have bubbles to fill in than when they connect the arrows. It's a model that people are used to from other things, the bubbles, but also it's not obvious what to do to connect the arrows, and most people don't read the instructions. Another thing that happens that is out of the voter control is that somebody drops out of the race, or somebody's ordered out of a race, or somebody ends up not being qualified for some other reason, and it's too late to take them off. Here's an example of splitting the contest. This is a governor's contest from a Wisconsin ballot, where they had some of the candidates at the bottom of the left-hand column and some of the candidates at the top of the middle column. Guess what people did? They voted twice. And so the thing to do really is to move them all up to the center. But election officials bore a void, and so they it really wigs them out to leave that white space there. Because you want to jam as much on a piece of paper as you possibly can, because it costs so much to do printing and processing. But these kinds of things are not just happening on paper. This is an example of an electronic touch screen. Nice resolution, huh? This is actually what it looked like to the voter. From Sarasota County in 2006. So best practice would be to have only one contest on this screen. But in Sarasota, the midterm ballot had a whole bunch of contests where there were two contests or more contests on the same page. The most notable one was a contest for House of Representatives. Normally, so I don't know if you even see it, but there's a state contest for governor. That's where the red circle is, and that's where the representative contest is. In a typical election, about 1% of voters don't vote for their congressional representative or other kinds of contests at that level. In this contest, 13.9%, something like 18,000 people, didn't vote for their congressional representative. That's just freaking bizarre. Why would that happen? Well, in the neighboring county, in Charlotte, the congressional race was by itself, and that had a totally normal, what's called undervote rate. It was about 1.5%. But on the next screen in that county were two contests, one for governor and one for attorney general. And guess what happened? The attorney general contest was undervoted at about 20% in this case. But the margin was wide enough, and it's attorney general, no big deal. Why should we? Yeah. So from county to county, we can see design differences made a big difference in performance for voters. There are a few more kind of classic problems that we see. And if you are involved in design at all, these probably look pretty familiar, right? these are things that should have been figured out, but these are things that get stopped by legislation or by systems. Here's another example from LA County. They continue to use the punch card system, but they've converted it to be an optical scan. So you push a marker through the hole, and then they scan them. And so one of the problems is the way the contests are presented. This one at the top, but this one on the side, actually caused people to undervote this contest because they thought it was part of the one above it. And since then, they've changed the formatting to be consistent. Now, there's been lots of research about this stuff, not just by political scientists, but also by design people. And eventually, we got down to 10 really basic design principles from a 300-page, 2-year research project. And this is what they look like. When we asked the question from the 300-page report and the 2 years' worth of study, what few things, if local election officials were going to do anything to improve the usability and the accessibility of their ballots and their other voter-facing stuff, what things could they possibly do? And we came down to this. It's a pretty simple set. And they're things that we practice when we create user interfaces all the time. Use mixed case, use big enough type, have a visual hierarchy that makes it obvious what's important, what's not important. So I want to show you a couple of examples of how we have progressed over the years. This is from Nebraska. This is the before. Not too bad, but you can see there's lots of all uppercase, centered headings and stuff like that. This little block of nastiness is the instructions. And when they applied the best practice, you can see right away that it's much more obvious how to navigate this thing, what the difference between the instructions and the contests are, things like that. In Marin County, I did a usability test in 2008 before we went to the election. These are the standard instructions, formatted as well as they could possibly be for California. And even in wealthy Marin County, where they have like a 99% voter turnout, people, when we tested the instructions, people were not clear what they should do. And so we simplified and just added a little white space, moved the action and the agent around, and had a much better outcome. Really simple, really small changes. And so these are the kinds of things that give me hope. I know that there are good things happening, and we have made a little more progress, actually. Unfortunately, most of these things are driven by problems. Back to Sarasota, after they had the 2006 congressional contest with the issues, where the Republican eventually won by 536 votes, they switched back to a paper optical scan system. And the local election director there was so scarred by her earlier experiences that she called up a couple of us and said, "Would you please come help me usability test this thing before we roll it out?" And of course we said yes. And so she had gathered up about 15 participants. Unfortunately, most of them were poll workers, so we're thinking, bad sample. But the outcome was that even the poll workers forgot to turn the ballot over and vote the second side. And so we did this really simple remedy. We added a little instruction at the bottom of the right-hand column on both sides, and compare it again to the neighboring county that didn't have that. Voters were much more likely to turn the ballot over and vote both sides. Really simple little things. In Minnesota, where there was also another high-profile Senate race, Al Franken eventually won. The Secretary of State there realized that one of the things that was really important in determining voter intent was what happened on vote-by-mail ballots. And a lot of people do vote by mail in Minnesota, even though you have to have a witness to do that. And so this is actually King County. They did that thing where they put a contest below the instructions, and people didn't vote on it. In Minnesota, you get these instructions when you vote by mail. It looks like a contract. And the illustrations are not lined up with the place where you would refer to them. So we did a couple of usability tests in St. Paul on a Saturday in the library. And they were so excited about this process that after we got through one iteration, the Secretary of State's office went and did a second one to validate that they had done the right thing. And this is what we ended up with. Much clearer. Secretary of State loves it. And they're having much better accuracy from voters just from changing the instructions. New York is like my favorite whipping boy. This ballot is part of a lawsuit. The minor parties sued the Board of Elections. There are minor party races here. This is how they go, right? This is one contest. This is another contest. This is another contest. So there's all this crap on here. The problem with this ballot really is what happens when you put it into the scanner. You get a screen that looks like this. Now, when you put your ballot into the scanner, and if there's a problem with it, it holds it. It doesn't reject it. It holds it and gives you a message saying there's a problem with your ballot. What would you like to do? Do you want to cast your ballot the way it is, green, or do you want to get it back and correct the mistakes? So this may be one of the first lawsuits in election history about usability. And so after some usability testing, again, we came up with this recommendation. Now, there's no color on this recommendation on purpose. This is not a wireframe. We're saying don't do any color here. It doesn't, this is not helping your cause. And added some explanatory text and simpler button labels. But this is still unsettled. This lawsuit is 3 years old, and they are not going to be able to implement in time for the November election. It's crazy. There's no good reason for this except that there are lawyers involved. Now, there are beautiful standards in place. They're called the Voluntary Voting System Standards. And there are a couple of iterations of them. These are research-based. They are well vetted. They've had plenty of public review and comment by both vendors and citizens and voters. But they're like 300 pages long. There are also other excellent reports, one from the Brennan Center for Justice. Actually, there are two now from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, who does all kinds of civil rights work. And a great project from AIGA called Design for Democracy. They actually did the monster report called Effective Designs for the Administration of Elections. It's beautiful. It's got every point and pixel spec'd out. But county election officials can't really handle that. They're not as geeky about letting and kerning as some of us are, and their systems won't necessarily support that. So after that came out in 2007, it took us a few years to figure out that we needed to boil these things down to something that's much simpler. And so this spring, I ran a Kickstarter campaign to create the field guides to ensuring voter intent. And this is how they came out. These are the first 4. They're all based on existing research. And we printed 500 sets in the first run. And in 2 weeks, they were all out with election officials across the country. And I still get orders all the time, even though we're well past the time that people are designing ballots. Now, the cool thing is, besides having all these new people, more than 300 people interested in basically UX and civic design, the MacArthur Foundation found us and said, we'd really like you to expand this program. And so we're doing 2 more projects right now, doing the research to look at county election websites, nobody's ever done that before, and to understand what is voter education and what are good ways to deliver that. Our next couple of projects are going to be about voting by mail and about multi-language ballots, which are huge issues and counties want desperately to know what to do about those things. Like San Francisco has 3 languages on the ballot. It's really hard to make that look good and be usable to everybody who needs to do that. Other counties are serving many more languages. Los Angeles County has to print ballots in 9 languages plus English. I don't know how you do that. Nobody actually knows how to do that. So we want to go work on that. So these are the field guides. You can download PDFs from this URL. Please do pass them around, print them out as little booklets yourself. Of course, you could order copies from me, but you have to pay for them. You'll be subsidizing copies for local election officials. Now, before I turn it over to Q&A, I just want to get a couple of things out of the way. One is, well, why can't I vote on the internet? Everybody wants to vote on the internet. All the kids want to do it. And even those states are passing laws saying you have to put voting on the internet. There are a lot of really good reasons to not do that. The first is, in the United States, by tradition, we guarantee a secret ballot. And so how do you authenticate someone when it has to be a secret? And we'd have to do some kind of authentication if people are going to vote online. The other thing is, people say, well, you know, I do all my banking online, I spend all this money online, and it's fine. But banks and financial institutions eat a lot of stuff that you never even hear about because it's not worth it for them. Their bean counters, their risk people are just saying, look, we'll just pay for that and we'll replace, you know, the nickel or whatever it is in 1 million accounts because we can do that. And we'll make the money up somewhere, some other way. You can't do that in elections. You can't go, you know, go find the lost vote and just replace it. It doesn't work that way. So there's just not the level of error tolerance in elections that you can have in financial systems, for example. So there are all kinds of security issues with voting online, but there's also this huge discussion in that geeky little world about what constitutes risk and how much we're willing to deal with. So right now, for example, for people who vote, who are in the military or who are overseas citizens, they get their ballots by mail, and they send them back by mail. This is really slow, and it means that the return rate is very low compared to how many ballots actually go out. So lots of counties have been sending blank ballots in PDFs to troops and to overseas citizens to fill out, and then they fax them back or they email them back. Now, the voter has voluntarily given up their secret ballot because they really want to cast a ballot. But this is not a secure system for returning a marked ballot, and this is totally freaking out some of the tin hat people because PDFs have boatloads of APIs in them, which are basically security holes. So you could put all kinds of gooey stuff in there, and that would not be good. So the discussion has now moved to, is this less secure than the mail system that we have now? Or is it about the same, or is it more secure? Can we make it more secure? It's really going to end up being a question of not yes or no, but how do we make this happen? So it's going to be a while, but it's not going to be soon. The other question I always get is, why aren't we just all using the same system, the same ballot, because that would make everything a lot easier? And that comes down to the 10th Amendment, basically. The 10th Amendment is the states' rights clause, and that says we are going to have elections. There will be elections at the federal level, but what happens after that? That's up to you guys. You deal with it. And so all of these different ways of approaching it have happened across the country. And it works for those regions and those states and those counties. And people really want to continue to own that, and there are a lot of good reasons to do that too. Having a centralized voting system, a little bit scary when it gets to the dictator thing. I don't know what. So those are to head off some of the questions from the Q&A. But before I go, I also want to encourage you to take a few steps that would also help this process. And the first is, please, it's not too late even for this election, sign up to be an election worker. You have to go through a few hours of training. It's a really long day. It pays crap. But that's probably true of most of your jobs anyway. But this job is crucially important to the success of an election. There is no job that is more important on election day, period. Not yours, not mine, poll workers. In the 2008 election, 3 million people served as temporary workers in this role. This year, there will be a much greater need because there will be many more precincts in lots of different places. So the other thing about this is the average age of poll workers in the United States is 72. So you all would bring that down substantially, and I think that would be a really good thing. Another thing you could do is there's a lot of material being generated right now, and it is for every single election. So one of the things you can do is you can volunteer to proofread ballots, proofread voter information pamphlets, proofread whatever is going out to voters, because it's really easy to miss some really simple things when you think you know what's supposed to be there. You know, it's hard to edit your own stuff. And so every county has procedures for doing this. You show up and you follow the procedures and they will love you forever. It's a really simple thing, doesn't take a lot of time on your part, and it really, really helps. Also, as I mentioned, every polling place has an accessible voting system. It is, in California, completely different from the voting system that people who don't have disabilities use, and it is kind of marginalized in most places. Poll workers don't get a lot of training on it, and they often don't get to touch it and use it and see what it's like. And so I encourage you, when you go to vote, to ask to use the accessible voting system. It will be a really cool experience for you on a number of levels if you are in UX and Chi and all those other, alphabets. Or even if you're an engineer, because there's some weird crap going on behind the scenes. But it will also take you longer to vote, so be prepared for that. My thinking in this, in encouraging all of us to go use the accessible system, is that it will stop being stigmatized, and poll workers and other people will have to start paying attention to this. Also, you don't have to show your disability card to go use this accessible system, but it gets treated that way. And there are lots of features of this system that would help lots of people who don't self-identify as disabled. Finally, as I mentioned, we have all these field guide projects going on. I encourage volunteers. One of the best things that ever happened was getting an intern. I just love that. And so the AIGA Design for Democracy Project and the Usability for Professionals Association, Usability and Civic Life Project often do projects together, and they're everything from what we call flash usability tests that are similar to, say, a hackathon. It's like the user research equivalent of a hackathon. You show up in the morning, you get some instructions, you get a little data collector, you go out to where you're assigned, intercept people on the street, watch them vote, come back, have a beer, share the stories, and continue to feed into what we're learning about design in elections. That's just one example of the kind of stuff that we're doing. We're going to do remote moderated usability tests on county election websites. We need help doing that because we need a really big sample to understand what we're finding out. So if you'd like to be involved in any of those things or things like them, see me afterward and give me your contact information. We'll put you on the roster and call you up when there's something going on where you live. All of these things are a great way to learn how local government works and start the trickle up. So that's what I wanted to tell you about tonight. So thank you very much for listening and staying awake. Who's got questions?
Can I ask the first question?
Sure.
So my overall feeling about the upcoming election is one of desperation. I don't know how many other people feel like it's hard to find choices in the current election.
Yeah, I can't do anything about that, sorry.
Yeah. So in desperation this morning, I was reading through the Green Party platform.
Uh-huh.
If I'm not happy with Democrats and Republicans, maybe the Green Party holds some promise. One of their platform planks is mandated 100% open source electronic voting. So I'll ask you, is electronic voting capable of helping the design problem, and is open source going to contribute to that effect, or?
There actually are a bunch of groups working on open source digital voting now. In fact, there's a group called the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation. It's sponsored by the Mozilla Foundation, among other backers, and they have been working for the last 3 or 4 years to create an entire election management system, including a ballot design suite, all through open source. And they're making excellent progress, and they've been doing small pilots in places like Travis County, Texas, where Austin is, on small sort of special elections and things like that. So I do think there's some potential there, and I think it's a direction that counties and states want to go in, because they don't like that the code is not available to them from the commercial voting system vendors. They want to be able to see what's going on there and have more say and more control of what's going on. There's a lot of discussion about how to handle that and what body should regulate that and maintain that, but that's not my area.
But if we could solve the problems with electronic voting, would it be better to have 100% electronic voting, or should it still remain a mix of different ways of
One of the
voting?
biggest problems with electronic voting is that it's really hard to do recounts. It's very easy to do recounts with paper ballots, because you have this artifact and it can be counted by hand. And so, 2 people can stand over your shoulder, one on the left, one on the right, as it were, saying, yes, that counts, that vote counts, or I challenge that. And so it's a totally physical process, but until you can, create something that's equivalent to do easy recounts, because the margins are not going to get much wider for a very long time, then that's the problem to solve.
Hi. You made a couple of statements about how certain ballot designs led to more mistakes by voters. For example, voting in by mail had more mistakes than voting at the poll.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the methods that you used to make that claim, and how big of a sample you needed to be convincing to an audience that's probably more used to quantitative data.
It is so easy to go look at ballots post hoc. They are public records in most states, except for Colorado, where it was just challenged. And they have to keep them for a certain number of years. The rules are different in different states. But these are paper forms that get archived. And so you can go look at them and you can actually see where people made mistakes, but you could see intent. And that's actually how recounts happen, is you go look at the paper ballots afterward. So that's one way. And that's really the biggest way. We also have conducted post hoc usability tests, basically reenacting elections, where you can see over somebody's shoulder what they're doing, and then talk to them, ask them why they did that, which is basically really traditional usability testing.
And have you done any studies on preliminary designs before people actually go to the polls?
Yeah, the paper ballot from Sarasota County, that was Labor Day weekend before the 2008 election, when they were going to go to press 5 days later. So they were able to make that change just in time. So yeah, it is happening more, but there are also more deadlines pushing up against that tiny little space that happens between having all the data that you need to put into the ballot and getting it ready to go for the first people who are voting. So for example, by law, counties have to have ballots available for military and overseas voters 45 days before Election Day. Yeah.
And when was the Democratic Convention?
The Democratic Convention finished on day 44, actually. So it was after. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, my question is about confirmation and checking with the voter, and that starts with the paper scanners that you mentioned. There was the error form with return the ballot or cast as is. So as one example of this, why doesn't it just always return the vote and require the voter to redo it, which we're going to get into in a second. But the other is that all of the electronic voting screens that I saw were slavish copies of paper forms. And there didn't seem to be any capacity for the system to say, you may choose 3 of these, you have chosen 2, you have 1 left to go, or when you
Right.
say move on to the next thing,
Yeah.
you've only chosen 2, are you sure you want to do that? And say yes. And then finally getting back to what you said, with the recount difficulty of these things, why wouldn't a system be able to print out a summary of your choices and have you, or even require a voter to confirm, this is what I picked, and turn it in? And I'm not talking about the technology here, I am specifically talking about design issues and what will a voter tolerate in terms of how much time they have to spend going over things again.
Yeah, we know, to answer your last thing first, and you'll have to remind me what the first and second ones were. To answer your last one first, we know that in places where people use electronic voting systems, like Maryland and Virginia, that they do not check the summary screen. They just press the green cast button. And on those systems, required by state law, there has to be a paper record. So there's a thermal fax roll that's attached to the system. Yeah, this was totally a kludge. That prints what the voter voted, and then at the end of the day, it prints a tally record without identifying the voters in any way. And the voter is supposed to be able to read that, but the print quality is so crappy, and the typeface is so awful, and there's this plexiglass cover on it, so it can't be tampered with. So you have fluorescent lights in somebody's garage, you can't possibly see that. So people just totally ignore it. Even when that paper record is not present, people don't check the summary screen. And the navigation on most of the existing commercial systems is so bad that it's really hard to figure out how to, just scroll down the page to see the next thing. So there's that. Your second question was about?
Interactive forms that tell the user you have chosen 2 out of 3
Yeah,
candidates,
so-
or you have overvoted, or that's not
Right.
allowed.
Yeah, no. Voting systems are designed by companies that make ATMs and cash registers. And until very recently. And so they sort of use those models. And, have you ever seen a really good ATM machine? No, they're all crap, right? And they're really expensive, which is the same thing is true of voting systems. Design is not the key thing there. Right now, we're still so much in the 90s with voting systems that election officials are just happy to have IT to run elections on. So we're way far away from getting to the experience part on those things. And your first question was about why it holds the ballot in the scanner. This rule is different from place to place. New York decided that they wanted their system to hold the ballot while it was returning messages to the voter. This very same voting system is used in plenty of other places, including here in San Francisco. And here it's programmed to reject the ballot and show a message, and voters don't get a plain English message necessarily, but poll workers are trained to use this little flip book to look up the message and tell the voter, explain what is going on and give instruction about what their options are. It's a complete Band-Aid. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that here we have the 3 or in San Francisco they have the 3 languages. In LA they had 9 or 10.
Yeah.
Anyway, from your research or even some of the just recommendations, have you had anything that deals with cultures or languages even that have different layouts or iconographies that go into, putting on the page, say like Arabic, for example, is a right to left language, whereas most of the other languages you see in the ballots are left to right, or, different things that might affect the layout, for example. Anything that came up in your research?
Yeah, little bits, but not nearly enough to make any design recommendations yet. This is not something that people have really studied very carefully or very much. And I haven't had a chance to go do it yet. We are pretty sure that of the combinations, based on what we've observed so far, that having two languages together, English and something else, is the best. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that most people who are voting a second language ballot have some functional English. And so they double check between the languages. And that makes it easier, and people have higher accuracy. Voters have higher accuracy that way. When you start adding languages, it's now harder to find your particular thing and compare it to English. So performance is not as good. Now, LA County is not going to put 9 languages on the same ballot. They're just not. But they haven't figured out yet what their next voting system is going to be. So they're working on that.
I'm curious as to why more errors happen when people vote by mail. It seems to me counterintuitive. You have more time. You're in your home environment, lighting, whatever.
Right.
Why is that?
One of the theories is that when you're in the polling place, even if you don't ask for help or clarification, that there's sort of this ambient help going on, right? You can see, even if you're not seeing what people voted on, what their choices were, you can see that they're connecting the arrow instead of putting an X there, for example. But yes, there's this opportunity to ask questions. Also, you can if you realize that you've made a mistake or your ballot goes into the tabulation machine, you can get a message back that says you've undervoted or overvoted or whatever. Do you want to try again? You're legally able to get 2 more chances to cast your ballot. And if you vote by mail and you make a mistake, at least in California, and this is true in most places, if you make a mistake and you mark up your ballot to correct it, you basically have spoiled your ballot and your vote is not going to count unless some gracious person or some smart group of election administrators has already documented the various ways that people make mistakes and made a determination of what's going to count and what's not. Because that ballot has to basically be remade by somebody in the election department. So you don't have the number of chances to recover from error because you don't have the feedback mechanisms. And often the stuff that comes in the package when you vote by mail is just utter crap. It's really confusing and not well designed and not clear. So those are the big reasons that we know about.
You mentioned that it takes a very, very long time to get changes to systems or to designs. Is this
we're not talking agile here.
is this primarily because of just large bureaucracy, or is it some partisan people actively blocking change because they think it's better for their candidates?
Anytime you expose something like this to sunlight, it takes a while to do that. You have to leave it out long enough for people to actually see it. So for the voluntary voting system guidelines, for example, the most recent version is dated 2005, but has not been completely accepted by the Election Assistance Commission. And there are a bunch of reasons for this. One is the public review periods are 120 days. That's a really long time to leave something out. The other reason is that the Republicans in Congress have successfully defunded the Election Assistance Commission, and so there are no commissioners now to make a decision about these things. So it's happening at a whole bunch of levels.
So this question might be answered by your previous answer. I'm curious about your thoughts on the commercialization of voting tabulation machines and the possible commercialization of ballot design and how those two might interlock.
Say more about what you mean about commercializing.
So if you were to, say, hire a professional design firm to design a ballot, if that might be of use.
If they were willing to do it for free or half what they normally charge, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no money to hire a designer. It's not like they don't want to do it. One county in Wisconsin had a choice of paving the roads or running an election. That's how tight money is in these places. And that kind of stuff is happening all over the place. So what I and my merry band of little election geeks have been trying to do is give skills at the local level so they can do the best possible job they can do within the constraints they have. So like today I spent an hour in the San Francisco election department with the people who are in charge of the ballot design and writing the, producing the voter information pamphlet, which is not a pamphlet because it's like 200 pages long. The first thing they did was hand me a before and after of the ballot to show me that based on the stuff that they saw in the field guides, that they had made some improvements within the legislation that they have to deal with and what their systems can also deal with. And so they were pretty proud of it. And actually it looks pretty good. And I hope people like it. I hope it helps.
Awesome. So just to clarify, there's no legal restriction, it's all financial.
Yeah, no, there's no legal restriction on having outsiders do this stuff. And in fact, outsiders are doing it all the time. So either the printers of the ballots or, if you're running electronic voting systems, there are companies that just do the programming of those things too. So there's this whole sort of mucky under world of people who do those things that have to go through vetting and certification and stuff like that. But yeah, the thing is that those people are cheap and they're already sort of in the system.
Can you talk a little bit more about the response and feedback you've been getting from county election officials to the field guides and whether they've been able to, you mentioned this just a second ago, if they've been able to use this information and guidelines in the current election?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's like I paid you for that. The uptake's been pretty good. Like I said, all 500 of the first set were taken up in about 2 weeks. But little pockets of wonderful are happening all over the place. So in California especially, I spoke at a conference in San Diego of California election officials. There were about 120 people there. That's like a third of the number of people who are involved in elections in California. I was on a panel with 2 election officials, one from Inyo County, California, and another one from Napa County, or Sonoma County. And after I finished my talk, I heard by email from the woman from Inyo County that she was so excited about the field guides that she was going to go redesign everything. She went to talk to her printer about this, who apparently is the interpreter of election code in Inyo County. They know all the legal parts. And the printer said, yeah, it's very limited what we can do because of all this stuff that's embedded in California election code to the ballot. But she applied the principles to all of her other stuff. And so she started sending me markups of her voter information pamphlet and the instructions that are in the ballot, in the voting booth, and all this stuff. She's an excellent student. And then she went on to work on her poll worker training materials. She has 120 poll workers in her county. And so she has a nice, beautiful suite that will look really great when I make my next proposal to the MacArthur Foundation. But she's really pleased that she was able to do this within the resources that she has. And that was really, really cool. The other person on the panel, the election director from Sonoma County, has been the election director for 40 years. Wow. She's about to retire after this election. She had actually announced her retirement for July, but they begged her to stay through the presidential election, even though she's been grooming people for a while. And so when I gave my talk, what I did was I opened up to page 27, and we basically did this Cosmo quiz on a whole bunch of ballot faces. And it was really fun. They had a great time. But, you know, here I am, and I'm an outsider. These people don't tolerate academics much, right? People coming in from the outside telling them how they should do their work. And so I tried to be very gentle about this and fun, and we had a good time doing it. But Janice from Sonoma County came up to me after the session, and now because she's been in the business for 40 years, she's like one of the rock stars in that world. And she's like 6'3". So she's imposing on a number of levels. And she came up afterwards, and I thought, she's just going to crucify me for what I've just done, because I have no business doing this. But what she said to me was that was the best presentation she'd ever seen in an election workshop, and that the field guides were the most exciting thing that she had ever seen in elections. And she was so excited about it that after she retired and she had a few weeks to hang out with her grandchildren, she'd really like to come on board to help with the rest of the field guides. So that was pretty cool. Yes?
Since you're such a font of knowledge, I'm just out of curiosity, do you have any idea how voting in the U.S. compares with outside the U.S.? And I have no idea. I just wonder.
Yeah, we actually, voting in the U.S. is far more complicated than any place else in the world.
Oh, okay, let me clarify. The voting mechanism, the ballots and the
Everything
counting
is more
and-
complicated. We let voters legislate more than any place else in the world. We vote on more contests than any place else in the world. Like Canada, for example, they have 2 levels of contests, municipal and federal. That's it. They don't vote on, ballot measures for the province or for the municipality or the riding, with the exception of Quebec, which decides it wants a referendum to secede every now and then. But their ballots are incredibly beautiful and really simple. In places like Australia and New Zealand, where they have ranked choice voting of a slightly different flavor from ours, that's the only thing they're voting on is who their minister to parliament is. And they mark 1, 2, 3. They put the numbers on the ballot, and that gets optically scanned and OCR'd and counted. Wow. It's really, really simple. Wow. In other countries where there are lots of subliterate voters, much simpler systems that use pictures of the candidates and or images, emblems from parties with either thumb ink to mark the ballot in the box, or they have really simple electronic systems where you press a sensor and it's automatically tallied. Yeah, we have the hardest voting system anywhere. We ask a lot of our voters. Yeah.
2 questions. I was in San Francisco for quite a while. I was wondering if you could comment on the ranked choice voting that we have there. The other question is, you said there's a shortage of money, and at the same time you want to avoid a lot of empty space, or you don't want to overpack the ballot with stuff, so empty space is good. Why not sell the empty space for sponsorship to raise money?
Well, that's called electioneering. And that's not legal. So that's an interesting idea, though. I'm sure somebody's going to try that at some point. Stephen Colbert basically suggested this on one show one night, that he would just be the sponsor of the election in North Carolina, and South Carolina, and about 25 people sent me the link to that episode. So yeah, I guess they decided not to do that. Ranked choice voting is really, really, really interesting. Local election officials like it a lot because the idea is that its other name is instant runoff. So the idea is that you can run a contest where you would normally end up with like a top two, and then you have a runoff election later, a couple months later. But you could save the cost of running that second election by having people rank their choices and then programmatically make the selection there until there's a clear winner. But we found out in a little exploratory study that we did last December with a demonstration ballot from Alameda County, which is basically the same layout and everything that San Francisco uses. They just echoed it completely. And a couple of samples from other places, like Portland, Maine, has ranked choice voting where they had 15 candidates for mayor, and you could rank all 15 on this grid. So we had a couple of examples that we went out and did a flash usability test. We had 40 voters between Oakland and San Francisco, and they all voted 2 ballots. And after they had finished voting, we asked them, so in both cases it was mayoral races that were ranked. How will your vote for mayor be counted? And out of the 40, 38 could not verbalize how that happens in any way that was remotely close. And in fact, they surfaced a bunch of really interesting mental models, like it's probably a point system. You have 1 point for your first guy and 2 points for your second guy and 3 points for your third guy, which is exactly the reverse, right? So we know people are voting counter to their intent over and over and over again. When I was at the election department today, we were talking about ranked choice, and the person who does outreach there had been working with a youth group where she was interacting with people who are 18 to 24. So this is going to be their first election that they're voting in. And so she was trying to teach them how to do ranked choice voting. And even after she explained how to mark the ballot and how the votes are counted, 8 of the 12 people in the room marked 1 for the first one, marked 2 candidates for the second one, marked 3 candidates for the third one. This is really hard for voters to get their heads around, especially when you would never do this in a system that you're, in a piece of software. You would totally separate these different modes of making data choices, right? So you get a ballot where you have these single contests. You're voting for a president candidate. You're voting for a representative candidate. You're voting for a mayor candidate. Then there are commissions and committees where you can vote for up to 3 or up to 5. And then we give them ranked choice, right? And then there are judge retention contests, and there are measures to vote on. We are just totally screwing with people. And we wonder why this is so hard. Ranked choice is by far the hardest thing. And there's nothing built into the design of the ballot that actually helps you suss out what the hell's going on. The numbering clearly is not helping, and the instructions are not close enough usually to where you're doing that to tell you what's going on. So people really don't understand the implications of what they're doing. And so this came to light in Oakland when they used ranked choice to elect the mayor for the first time a couple of years ago. And there were protests and demonstrations because people didn't understand how a mayor got elected with only getting 24% of the vote in the first round ranking. And so they don't trust her. There was a recall, petition and all that stuff. So, and that happened to coincide with all the Occupy stuff. Didn't help her cause at all. So, who's next?
Yeah, I was wondering, when you were talking about the local elections officials and how they were constrained because of the guidelines, it seemed clear that it was that state guidance that was really important, that the secretaries of state are the ones you want to reach. So I'm just wondering if you could speak more to that and to what extent they're being reached and that can change. Because for all the examples you gave, there were plenty in which the person doing the ballot design did something within those constraints,
Yeah.
but it was the constraints that were the
Right.
problem.
Well, that's true of all design problems, right? They all
Sure,
have
sure.
constraints. But the Secretary of State is really key to making this work in a lot of places. Deborah Bowen, Secretary of State of California, does not care about design at all. She has hung her hat on election reform related to security. And so she conducted top to bottom security review a couple, 3 years ago, and basically decertified every voting system in California, which didn't make the county people happy at all, because now what the hell are they supposed to do? So they're using uncertified systems is what they're doing. But in other places, like Oregon, Washington, Ohio now, believe it or not, the Secretary of State's offices really have begun to embrace the importance of usability and design, because they understand that the ripple effects on the administration side are positive for them. Their costs go down and the number of lawsuits go down, things like that. So Ohio, for example, for the first time issued a ballot directive based on these guidelines and then created a template. Now, you could still make a really ugly ballot, even if you follow these guidelines, and Cuyahoga County has succeeded in doing that. And advocates are really complaining about that. But it is secretaries of state who get that there's a voting experience who begin to embrace design at every level of elections that you're going to hear less about, because things are actually working there. What you're going to hear about is places like New York, where there are all kinds of crazy things about the way the ballots work, and the type is too small. Does that answer your question, Eric?
So I recently changed my residence address from Santa Cruz County to Santa Clara County, so I just registered online, which is cool. You can register through the
California
State
has online voter registration for the
website.
first time.
You have to be willing to give up your driver's license number,
Right.
but it's just the registration. It's not the actual vote. So I put on my tinfoil hat and I checked the box that says vote by mail, because ever since the Bush-Gore election, I don't trust these voting machines.
It does go through the voting machine
Yeah, I was going to
eventually.
say, is this a reasonable way for me to feel that I've protected myself a little bit from the vagaries of the voting system, or am I just opening myself up to more errors that I'm going to make?
You're probably opening yourself up to more errors, actually. In California, in most places, there's a tabulation machine in each of the polling places. But in some places, it's what's called central count. And so all the tabulation happens back at Election Central. And, we see instantly that a lot more votes are lost because people made mistakes that were not caught at the polling place, because there was no feedback. And it's not obvious just by looking at the ballot, which is, one thing. That would make it secret for sure. So yeah, you're probably not actually helping yourself. The reason to vote by mail in California is because there's always so freaking much on the ballot that it takes you half an hour to vote. So, when you do it at home, you have plenty of time. You can, pull out the big Guardian and whatever else you use to check your slate.
But how is it that in California 50% of the voters did you say 50%?
About 50%
Use vote by mail?
vote by
I
mail.
had no idea it was anywhere near that. I would have guessed 2%.
Yeah, no, it's quite high. And one of the reasons is because there's often so much on the ballot. But the other reason is that the Secretary of State has offered it for many years. California was one of the first states to offer permanent vote by mail status, where you just automatically would get your ballot by mail. There's still plenty of places where you have to have an excuse to vote absentee. So, over here, and then we'll come back.
You mentioned the difficulty people have with the ranked choice voting. Have there been tests of different ways? Like, I would think a lot of people in this room would assume that you would have a column to check first choice, another column for second choice, and another column for third choice.
Oh, there are lots of really interesting ways to present this. And they all, as far as we've been able to tell, are not successful. at least all the models that we've seen. I think I've collected 8 or 10 different ways of doing it. Yeah, well, one of the problems with ranked choice voting is the mental model people bring to a ballot to begin with. In the United States, we vote for the winner. We don't have a second choice, especially when we're talking about, board of supervisor positions and stuff, assessor, right? They're often uncontested anyway.
Does San Francisco have ranked choice for every office?
Yeah, I think it does have ranked choice for every county office now. That's not a multi-candidate choice. Yeah, I think that's right. That's not true everywhere. Most places it's just mayor, or it's just a couple of positions. So different places are trying a lot of different things. Portland, Maine has this grid where you can rank all of the choices. So there were 15 candidates, and so 15 by 15. There are some interesting problems with their particular design, like the instructions were on the right-hand side after you finished voting. But North Carolina also, besides having straight party voting, except for president, allows ranked choice voting in some jurisdictions, and they actually included some pretty nice instructions that I'll be very curious to see how they work right at the ranked choice that doesn't just talk about how to mark the ballot, but what you're doing by doing that. So there's a lot of experimentation going on there, and everybody's just sort of making it up. So until I get some money, I won't have any really good answers for that.
So one idea for ranked choice would be the Netflix DVD queue, where your top choice goes to the top.
Yeah, electronically there's a lot of stuff. If you're voting
Exactly.
on a screen, there's a lot of stuff you can build into the UI to prevent people from doing something stupid.
And, the old lever machines prevented you
Right.
from making mistakes.
Right.
They're all interlocked and
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, exactly.
I like those a lot.
Yeah, people love the lever machines, but yeah, they're all mothballed now.
And they had to be mechanically programmed for
Yeah,
every election.
so don't tell me that nobody ever tampered with those things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then
especially in New York.
one last observation about the California ballots. You get a practice ballot in the mail, and so if you want to take the time to fill that out
Yeah.
before you go to vote,
Yeah.
you have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I definitely recommend that. One thing that's a little different this year is that you can opt to get your voter information pamphlet electronically. And so now you don't have the double-page spread of the sample ballot. You have to deal with that on your own. And somebody I was talking to the other day kind of complained that, she had opted for the green version, but now she had made this trade-off where she didn't have this little handy tool. So there's some discussion in the department of just sending out, postcard size sample ballots to sort of remedy that, because they've got a bunch of people have called in already saying, I missed the sample ballot. So.
How does the state rationalize the privacy of the mail-in ballots?
Oh, there's a very intricate process for dealing with mail ballots. They are physically separated, and different people do different parts. So in one room, somebody takes off the mail envelope and checks off that that's happened, and there are all these checklists and balance sheets and stuff. And then those get moved, all the opened ballots get moved to someplace else to verify the secrecy envelope, et cetera. And it's very, very well done. And actually in LA County, they have cameras on the whole process. You can watch it happen. Totally transparent. Not every county is that comfortable with that kind of nudity, but it actually is really well done, and it's very cleanly practiced because there can be observers present at any time to see what's going on there. Other questions? Have I exhausted you yet? I could go on like this for hours, but
Thank you.
let's have a drink. Thanks very much. This was fun.